Francis I of France is inevitably compared to Henry VIII. Both kings had big personalities, big love affairs, and big scandals that rocked the face of Europe. But there's a lot more to Francis than just the similarities to the Tudor counterpart. From his unlikely ascension to the throne, to his brutal defeats and torturous later years, Francis did not languish in his neighbor's shadow. With his insane affairs and scandals, Francis I is often compared to Henry VIII, except his story is much worse. Madness made him a tyrant, and when his end came, it was both fitting and brutal. Stick around for more on that later. Born Francois of Angoulême in 1494, the man who came to be Francis I was never supposed to see the throne of France. His parents were from a minor branch of the royal family, and he was the great-great-grandson of King Charles V of France, whose reign ended nearly a century before Francis's birth. With that much distance, no one expected him to rule. But as we'll see, when it comes to succession crisis, things are never simple. Before Francis had to face the possibility of inheriting the throne, he endured a dark twist of fate. In 1496, his father died suddenly. Francis was 2, and his mother, Louise of Savoy, was just 19. But instead of giving into grief, Louise stepped up to the plate. She took charge of Francis and his sister Marguerite's education. She prepared him for every possibility the future held, including an ascent to the throne. Henry VIII was obsessed with having a male heir, but he seems tame in comparison to Louis XII of France, who ascended to the throne when Francis was just a child. However, luck was not on his side. Thanks to French law, his 2 daughters couldn't take the throne, and that male heir did not appear. And if you traced your finger down the line of succession, there was Francis. Francis's childhood was spent in a sort of limbo, waiting for a metaphorical axe to fall. Would Louis XII have a son, thus relegating Francis to a minor position in the court? Or would he die without a son, leaving Francis to be king? Well, in 1505, when Louis XII fell ill, it looked like he finally had his answer. But Louis wasn't just about to let his name and his issue fall into obscurity. For Francis, the crown came with a big condition. Fearing for his life, Louis XII summoned his courtiers to his bedside and insisted, for the good of the kingdom, that Francis should marry his eldest daughter, Claude. Francis was only 11, and Claude was 6 years old. After some debate, the nobility allowed the two to become engaged, but Louis XII had another surprise up his sleeve. He recovered from his illness, at least temporarily allowing Francis a few more years of freedom. Francis would become the victim of his predecessor's plotting in more ways than one. See, the potential union between Francis and Claude had infuriated quite a few very important people. That's because Claude's mother had plans of her own for her daughter, preferring instead to wed her to the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This plan had been in motion long before Francis came on the scene, and it didn't end well. Marriage wasn't the only thing that those in power had decided for Francis before he even hit adulthood. When Louis XII betrothed Claude to Francis, it set the stage for a feud between Francis and Charles V, long before either young man saw the throne. As we'll see, this would go on to have violent and disturbing repercussions for Francis when he hit the throne. In denial that he wasn't going to have a son, Louis XII began to arrange another marriage for himself in 1514. Still, as an insurance policy, he finally wed his daughter Claude to Francis in May of that year. If there was a honeymoon period, it was short. Soon after, Francis had to welcome a new mother-in-law to the fold when Louis XII married again. However, this last-ditch effort would have disastrous consequences. After tying the knot for the 3rd time, Louis XII got right to the important task of baby-making with his new wife. On January 1st, 1515, Louis XII passed at the age of 52. Many whispered that the overexertion in the bedroom was what took his life, but realistically, it was probably gout. Either way, it meant one thing. After years in limbo, Francis I would finally become King of France. What did Francois of Angoulême, now King Francis I, do with his newfound power? Well, the ongoing Italian Renaissance proved to be a great influence on him, and he became a patron of the arts and letters and began grand building projects. It was a testament to his education. Did he start out a great ruler? Absolutely. And how was he as a young husband? Not so great. Instead of throwing himself into married life, Francis kept his wife at an arm's length. It may seem like a cold move, but he had his reasons. Look at it this way. He was young and powerful, and there were people coming at him from all angles looking for a piece of their own. He trusted those he knew best, his mother and his sister, Marguerite. This, unfortunately, came at the expense of his young wife. Francis may have been a husband and a king, but he still was only 20. He wanted to sow his wild oats. Francis had a wandering eye, and sadly for his wife Claude, it didn't wander too far. He began an affair with one of Claude's courtiers, who had a scandalous side of her own. Her name was Mary Boleyn. When it came to affairs with kings, Mary was the first to put the Boleyn name on the map. She had been in France to serve the previous queen, but stayed on after Louis XII's passing, putting her right in Francis's orbit. He gave her a number of nicknames, including the English Mare and My Hackney. When the relationship between Francis and Mary Boleyn dissolved, it didn't appear to be a matter of great heartbreak. There were rumors about Mary and other French courtiers, and Francis got back on the horse as well. When he called the Count of Chateaubriand to court, he didn't expect to fall for the man's wife. But that's exactly what happened. Her name was Françoise de Foix, and to the king, she was a lot more than an innocent crush. For 2 years, Francis showered Françoise's family, including her husband and her brothers, with gifts, favors, and titles, all in an attempt to seduce her. While many other power-hungry courtiers would have been powerless against this display, Françoise didn't seem to be interested in Francis. But of course, this didn't stop him from trying. And what about Francis's wife? Well, as a member of the House of Valois-Orléans, she was the genetic victim of her ancestors' attempts to keep the power in the family. As such, she was short and suffered from scoliosis. She also took her job as a royal baby maker pretty seriously, and pregnancy after pregnancy took its toll on her body. Soon after Francis ascended to the throne, his wife gave birth to their first child, a girl. They got right back into trying, and she was pregnant again soon after. Another girl came, and with her, the pressure was on both Francis and Claude to keep producing children until they had a son. Finally, in February 1518, they got what they wished for, and Claude gave birth to a boy. After Louis XII's disastrous end, it was a massive win for the French royals, and they planned a celebration worthy of the occasion. During the boy's baptism, Francis I enlisted help from an unexpected source. He honored Jean de Chateaubriand and his wife, Françoise de Foix, with a role in the ceremony. This was the first official event where the people got a glimpse into the way Francis was favoring her, and it caused a scandalous ripple through the court. Francis pursued Françoise de Foix for years before she became his official mistress. When he finally made her his chief mistress, their romance met violent resistance. Surprisingly, it was not Francis's wife who was mad. Having grown up in the royal court, she expected this sort of thing. No, Françoise met an even more dangerous foe in the form of Francis's mother. She loathed the Foix clan so much that Françoise's presence may have actually served to distract her from her habitual bullying of Queen Claude. Whereas Francis's mother made her unhappiness known, his match with Françoise had support, or at least indifference, from another unexpected source. Françoise's husband didn't seem to care that his wife was cavorting with the king. When Francis made moves to send him away to Brittany a few years into the affair, he didn't protest. He just went and left Françoise at court, free to fulfill her position as chief mistress, which is exactly what she did. As much as it may seem like Francis's reign wasn't all hanging out with artists and wooing the ladies, his predecessor had left him in the middle of a number of power struggles and military conflicts, including his long-running rivalry with Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, Francis had tried to win that title at an election in 1519, but Charles had outmaneuvered him, and it wouldn't be the last time they'd end up fighting. Even though Francis I might not have seemed particularly loyal to his wife, his feud with Charles, of course, went back to her. Her mother had arranged for her marriage to Charles, only for her father to veto it and insist she marry Francis. Even though Francis had won, Charles was still a thorn in his side. He ruled over Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and a handful of territories that bordered France. Their checkered past did not make them good neighbors. Francis found a decisive victory early in his reign when he captured Milan in 1515, but good things can't last forever. In the search for an upper hand against each other, Francis and his enemy both looked for an ally in the same place. When Francis heard that Charles had met with Henry VIII, he came up with an elaborate plan to win the upper hand. He was supposed to meet with Henry in 1520 for a summit, and he decided that he'd go to extreme lengths to impress the Tudor king. The plan began early with the offer of a gentlemanly bet, which almost caused an international incident. In the months preceding the Field of the Cloth of Gold, both kings agreed not to shave their beards until they finally met in person. Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, grew sick of his au naturel look and demanded he trim the whiskers. As a considerate husband, Henry obeyed his wife. Big mistake. The French were outraged. To them, it seemed like the English had just snubbed France for Spanish interests. Luckily, the English ambassador to France, who was ironically Anne Boleyn's father, Thomas Boleyn, assured Francis's mother that their love is not in the beards, but in the hearts. Sure, that's a nice way of saying, these guys are already weirdly competitive. At the summit, the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Francis spared no expense. But he wasn't the only one. Each king tried to outspend and outdo the other, and the result was a lavish, elaborate event that could have bankrupted them both. There were 2,800 golden tents, fountains full of wine, and the rulers and their retinue went through nearly 2,200 sheep during feasts. But beneath the grotesque displays of wealth, there was a serious undercurrent of tension. Among all the entertainment, a number of tournaments took place, but to minimize risk, neither king was supposed to compete against the other. Well, Francis was in for a disturbing surprise. Henry VIII surprised him and everyone in attendance by challenging him to a wrestling match. Henry may have thought that he was about to make a big splash, but he was actually in for a major embarrassment. Francis I handedly beat Henry VIII into a wrestling match at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Francis and Henry had used the time to build goodwill between France and England, but the Tudor king was about to ruin it all in one fell swoop. Soon after this meeting of the egos, one of the most influential figures in the Tudor court, Cardinal Wolsey, signed a secret treaty with Charles V, aligning England with Spain in the event of a conflict with France. The announcement sent shockwaves throughout Europe, and, well, if it was a conflict that they wanted, a conflict is what they got. The Italian Wars from 1494 to 1559 would come to define Francis's military career. Although they started before his birth, this Franco-Italian grab for land put him at never-ending odds with the Holy Roman Empire. For Francis, this culminated in the 4 years of war in 1521, and a series of humiliations that would forever taint his name. First, the French lost Lombardy, but that loss was nothing compared to the betrayal that followed. One of Francis's dukes, Charles of Bourbon, double-crossed him and sided with the Spanish forces in the middle of all this turmoil. Things were bad out in the battlefields, but somehow, they were even worse at home. Francis's wife Claude had given him 7 children in as many years, but the string of pregnancies had taken its toll on her body, and she perished at the age of 24. Her tragic loss was made even sadder by the fact that few people, other than her children, seemed to care. And that's not even the darkest part. There were twisted rumors that Francis, with his womanizing ways, had given her syphilis, and that's what had taken her life. Whether it weighed on his conscience or not, Francis had little time to contemplate it. He had to go back into battle. Francis then attempted to retake Milan, and it came to a climax in the most shameful moment of his entire reign. During the Battle of Pavia in 1525, enemy forces captured the French king and delivered him to Charles V. The Holy Roman Emperor held Francis as a POW in Madrid for 1 long, humiliating year. Francis needed to make a deal with Charles V to get out of there, but it would come at a massive cost. Francis was a prisoner with no leverage, so to free himself from the Holy Roman Empire, he had to make a horrible deal. Not only did he have to give up his claim to Artois and Flanders and marry Charles' sister, Francis also had to surrender his eldest sons, Francis and Henry, as hostages to Spain. Once he was free, Francis immediately repudiated the treaty, arguing it was made under duress. Did that get his sons back? Oh, absolutely not. As we'll see, that was just one of the battles he had to face in the coming years. Francis returned to France an irrevocably changed man. Was it a bruised ego? A premature midlife crisis? Maybe even the loss of his wife? No matter what the cause, Francis quickly fell for a new woman, Anne de Pisseleu-d'Ailly. There was just one problem. That would be the presence of his reigning chief mistress, Françoise de Foix. Despite her initial reticence, Françoise had spent the last 10 years falling deeply in love with King Francis. And while it was likely he had other mistresses, she'd always been number one, until Anne came on the scene. For 2 long years, Françoise put up a fight for her man, but it was a losing battle. Francis made Anne his chief mistress in 1528. Though it's likely Francis would have kept Françoise around in a lesser role, she retreated to her husband's castle in Brittany. In 1536, Francis faced a living nightmare and twisted mystery. At age 18, his son Prince Francis, Duke of Brittany, was enjoying a round of tennis. Parched from exercise, he asked for a glass of water. The healthy boy drank it, then collapsed and perished after several days of illness. The secretary who brought Prince Francis the water was himself brought to France by a new figure on the scene. Her name? Catherine de' Medici. Francis's men used barbaric techniques to get the secretary in question to confess. He said that it was not Catherine who told him to poison the prince, but the king's foreign enemy, Charles V of Spain. Francis had the secretary executed, but Charles V insisted he had nothing to do with the plot. History generally agrees the prince passed thanks to sudden tuberculosis, and that Francis's men violently coerced the count into confessing guilt. Of course, with his eldest son out of the picture, Francis's new presumptive heir was his next son, Henry, and to say that Henry had a daddy and mommy issues would be an understatement. Henry was born entitled, and his time in captivity hadn't fixed it. In fact, it just made him a little more twisted. For one thing, there was the issue of his mistress. When Diane de Poitiers first showed up at the French court, she had her eye on Francis I. King Francis appreciated her smarts and political ingenuity, but wasn't interested in her for more than that. So, in a very ick move, the 35-year-old Diane transferred her affections onto Francis's 15-year-old son Henry. And that's not the most twisted part. When it came time for Henry to marry, both Francis and Diane agreed on the same candidate, the aforementioned Catherine de' Medici. Well, Henry put up with it, but he also flaunted his affair with Diane right in front of his young bride. But that wasn't the only thing that Henry put Catherine through. When Francis wed his son to Catherine de' Medici, both were just 14 years old. After the festivities were over, the bride and groom retired to their bedchambers. But they weren't alone. As was the tradition, King Francis and a handful of his trusted advisors watched as his son and Catherine consummated their union, to make sure the deal was fully sealed. How much did Francis hate his enemy Charles V? So much he boldly went where no Christian king had gone before, which is to say, he grew so tired of all the European leaders siding with Charles V that he hooked up with the Ottoman Empire. Francis was the first ruler to make a diplomatic alliance between the Christian and non-Christian empire, and it caused a heck of a scandal. At this point, Francis was so determined to capture territories in Italy, he didn't care who he teed off. Francis initiated another set of conflicts in Italy, perhaps hoping to avenge his and his son's captivities. Unfortunately, it blew up in his face. Francis was also sending out fleets in the New World and Asia, hoping to expand his circle of influence. Before long, he was out of both money and allies. After a few years, he had to call it quits. According to legend, Francis I spent his last feverish moments lamenting the crown on his head. He thought it was a gift from God at first, but on his deathbed, he realized what it really was, a curse. Soon after, he passed, and when doctors cut open his body, they made a disturbing discovery. The pressures of being king had ravaged his body, and they found an abscess in the stomach, his kidneys shriveled, his entrails putrefied, his throat corroded, and one of his lungs in shreds. Many kings go before their time, leaving heirs that are too young or unable to reign on their own. Not the case with Francis I. He died on the same day that his son and successor, Henry II, turned 28. After all, what's a better birthday gift than a crown? Unfortunately, Francis's greatest enemy, Charles V, outlived him. You can't win them all. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.